We're thrilled to have Craig DeLarge here visiting with us today. I want to thank everybody for joining our 90 at 90. A couple of housekeeping reminders. You can submit questions at any time during this interview to 9090@ehsmail.com. That's 9090@ehsmail.com. And Craig will be around to answer those questions. Very much appreciate you joining us today, Craig.
Yep, glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
You've got an extensive background in pharmaceutical marketing, in e-marketing, and multi-channel marketing.
Yeah.
Why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Okay, thank you. So I have been in the industry, the pharma industry, for about 25 years now, working for a variety of companies. In fact, you and I met shortly out of school when I was working for IMS and then CMI. I've also worked for J&J, Merck, GSK, and Novo Nordisk at that time. And those have all been various types of marketing roles. As it relates to the topic we're talking about today, the last 15 years in particular, I've been working in various digital customer relationship marketing and multi-channel marketing centers of excellence in about 4 or 5 different pharma companies. I've also been engaged with leadership coaching during that time, as a lot of the roles that I've been in have been related to change leadership. And so looking forward to kind of delving into some of those topics and glad to bring my expertise to this forum today.
Super, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you perceive as the greatest pain points for pharma marketers today when it comes to digital media?
Yeah. So, there are really 3 that kind of come to mind immediately for me. One is what I would call an over-reliance on the personal selling model, which is not, surprising. I mean, the fact is we've built a multi-billion-dollar industry through the effective use of personal sales forces. It's just that the environment and the marketplace and our customer requirements are changing so that while that particular channel is effective, its effectiveness is waning. Thus, the incremental use, in some cases the replacement use, I would dare say, of digital channels is something that's really important and that will continue to grow, which actually leads to the second pain point, and that is what I would call a lack of trust. There's not really any more, I don't think, a lack of understanding digital. I mean, we've been spending 15 years now, learning and grooming the industry on the performance of digital channels. But I would say that there's a lack of trust by many of our leaders in the majority of our companies in terms of believing that customers will in fact change their behaviors and actions positively as it relates to the business and customers through their interaction with the digital channels, whether that's from a communication standpoint or from a workflow standpoint at this stage. And then the third thing I would say is just a lack of scale. So it's not that pharma companies are not investing in digital, but the scale at which they are doing so is still too much at what I would call a pilot level versus being at more substantial levels like what we see, frankly, with the sales force.
Yeah, the lack of trust is interesting. As you know, I'm writing a book, and thank you for being interviewed for that book.
Yeah.
One of the comments that I got from someone in pharma, which I thought was really interesting, was that the senior leadership didn't trust digital as a medium, yet when you look at how they spend their lives when they go home, they're doing their banking online. Everything they do is completely digital, and yet somehow they still feel like their customers aren't online. What do you think? What do you think causes that perception?
Yeah, well, so obviously I think one is that we don't believe that what's good for us in terms of making our lifestyles effective is equally or more good for our customers. So that's one thing. But the other thing, and I'll speak bluntly here, the personal selling model is a very well-proven, well-entrenched methodology and power center in our companies. And it stands to reason that leaders who have built their careers on that and gotten to where they are in their careers, having come out of personal selling cultures, are going to hold on to that. And so I think that in many ways, the tipping point towards digital being a more predominant method that we trust when it comes to our marketing and our selling is something that's going to come with a refreshing leadership in the industry itself. Right. So, one of the things that I've been want to say to my teams when I've been in various organizations is that while certainly we do the work every day of educating and influencing and creating understanding and a track record for the positive performance of digital, we shouldn't expect that we're going to be, that it'll be taken for granted until we have senior directors and vice presidents who are of the generation of leadership that built their careers on digital. Until we get there, it's always going to be a fight uphill.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I can remember the early customers of digital when I was selling it 15 years ago, saying, part of the reason we're buying is for education, because we know, kind of like in senior leadership today, we know the older doctors are never going to go there. However, we also know that it's going to be the newer doctors that become the older doctors and the high prescribers. So there is a generational kind of changeover happening, changing of the guard.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you a question to benefit our publishing audience today. What incremental value can publishers bring to the table for the pharma marketer that either we aren't doing enough of, or we should be doing, or we need to be doing more of?
Yes, there are a few things. So, fundamentally, and this is going back to my days at CMI, where for 5 years I was the media director at CMI, one of several media directors at CMI Compass. One of the things, obviously, that we always rely upon our media partners to do for us is to get us in front of customers in contexts where those customers are looking for information and educating themselves, and that we will be a part of that environment in terms of our communication, and that we will also benefit from the standpoint of what I'll call the authoritative halo that actually comes with being in that environment. And so the media does a good job of that, but I think that some areas where there's an opportunity to do more have to do, one, with bringing more insights to we as advertisers around what makes for engagement with the particular audience that you are an expert at serving from an informational standpoint. Another one is producing more and better data that reflects how your channel is performing and how customers are engaging with that channel, not only in terms of reach and frequency, but also from a qualitative standpoint, what do they think of the content, as well as a contextual standpoint. What are the situations throughout their workday and within their workflow where they're getting the most value out of using that particular channel that the publishers own and have been building. And then the final thing I would say is content innovation. I mean, one of the things that we've really been grappling with as an industry at large is that the, I won't say quality, but the level of engagement or the ability of our content to consistently get the attention of our customers. And this is amid, an explosion in the number of media options that customers have to interact with, and an explosion in the types of formats that customers have to interact with, from print to infographics, video, social media. And what it's done is it's begun to crowd out many of the traditional publishing channels that we've used. And so I think that there's a great deal of opportunity for publishers to do a better job of bringing content innovation ideas to the table as a part of they continually refreshing the value that they can offer to advertisers.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You just summed up a lot of the challenges that many of our publishers face. As you know, we work with a lot of traditional medical societies, associations, journal publishers, and the notion of having the quality brand, the first thing that you said was very important.
Yeah.
They've always excelled at. They've got highly credible content, peer-reviewed content. The second piece, the measuring of the engagement and hitting the right user at the right time, I think probably scares many of them because they're still trying to get their hands around how best to measure that.
Yes.
So it is interesting. We're kind of in a changing the guard there as well, and the relative weight probably of those things is changing over time.
Right.
In terms of the importance to you as a buyer.
Right, absolutely, I agree. Actually, there's one other thing I'd like to mention. So, piggybacking on that last point I made about measurement and data, a pain point that we're all struggling with right now is not only how to get data, but how to get that data clean and integratable into our larger data sets that we use for analysis. And certainly companies have their own internal limitations and frustrations with this, but in working with external publishers, vendors, and suppliers where we run programs, a pretty regular barrier that we run into is not being able to get clean integratable data that allows us to actually put the performance of any given channel or publishing property easily up against other investments that we're making. And so that's another area, if there's a value add or a fix that can be implemented, is really getting a better understanding of how customers, in this case advertisers, are struggling with that dilemma and bringing solutions to bear around that.
Are those barriers more around privacy or more around cleanliness of the data?
It's both, actually.
Okay.
Because we all have to make sure that we're being compliant when it comes to how the data is sourced and the permissions around how it's gotten. And every pharma company has privacy staffs that work with vendors in order to make sure that that's compliant. But then very often when we get over that hurdle, what we then find is we get the data, we've got the right compliance things in place around the data, but it's not clean and it's not easily integrated. Right.
That's a great segue into my next question. And let me just diverge for a minute and pick up on that privacy theme. One of the things that we see that is a little bit frustrating, and maybe you can explain it from the marketer standpoint, is that the view on privacy on the consumer side, and many of our publishers, that we kind of fall into two major buckets: those that represent physicians and healthcare professionals, those that represent patients and caregivers. On the consumer side or the patient side, pharma is extremely sensitive about data and privacy because of HIPAA regulations. They don't want to do any specific targeting to a specific patient with a known condition, for example. They want to get more precise about how they target, but they don't want to know the individual that they're targeting for HIPAA reasons. On the physician side, it's kind of the other end of the spectrum, and I guess part of that is because they perceive the physician as their customer, and so they already have a data file on that individual. But many want data down to the user level in terms of what was the interaction. And that's always a challenge for us because we're kind of wrestling with multiple publishers who all have slightly different privacy policies, the right to use data. What are you seeing? Is that and this is, I guess, a question directly for our publishers who we're always pushing towards better physician authentication, more transparency with data, more usability of the data to help you do those measurements. So I guess my question for you is, how big of a competitive disadvantage is it for those publishers who aren't willing to open up the data silo and share with the advertiser what the interaction rates are, what the viewability metrics look like on a user by user level?
Oh, okay. So my take on this is that today it is not much of an individual disadvantage because the majority of everyone is doing an equally poor job at it, right?
So maybe it's a competitive differentiator if somebody does a great job at it.
Absolutely. And so I think that this statement is really, when you ask about what more can be done, right? This is about who will actually accelerate and make it a disadvantage for everybody else. Right? And do understand that companies and their agencies, though they may not have gotten around to making it such a huge requirement yet, because they're still working at getting their internal houses in order around this, it won't be long before when the internal house is set and better together around this issue, it will then quickly flip.
Yeah.
And I think that publishers can do themselves a favor by getting ahead of the curve on that and preparing their internal processes, procedures, infrastructures,
Yeah.
being proactive actually in reaching out to the agencies and the manufacturing advertisers, beginning to collect requirements, gauging at how soon in the future will they be wanting this type of information,
Yeah.
even exploring if there are not data partnerships that they could lend their information to, or data that they could get where they could do some of their own analysis.
Yeah.
And I think this is particularly the case when you consider, and this will apply to every publisher, but any publisher or most publishers are fundamentally an expert regarding a particular customer segment. I mean, that's what keeps them in business, right? Is
Sure.
that you've got a property where you've got the inside track and a level of intimacy with a group of customers. And so the better the publisher understands that customer, the more value they will be able to add going beyond just advertising back to the agency and the manufacturer.
Yep.
And so I think that innovative publishers have already begun to and will continue to establish that as an incremental competitive advantage for themselves, and woe to those who get caught behind.
Interesting.
Right.
That's great information for our publishers. Is they're all trying to figure out, exactly where to go. It is a competitive advantage to have this data and make it usable and help your customers,
Absolutely.
the advertiser,
Yes.
leverage as much as possible.
Yes.
But let me dig a little bit deeper on the pain points, and in particular, I want you to think about the two groups in the audience today, those that reach physicians and healthcare professionals versus those that reach consumers and patients.
Yeah.
How do the pain points and your needs differ on those two sides of the fence?
Yeah. So I would say that, so on the patient side, okay, I'm going to do a bit of jumping back and forth here.
Sure.
So on the patient side, I would dare say that the lack of attention to and emphasis on the caregiver as a part of the equation is a significantly lost opportunity.
But by
We're-
publishers or by marketers or both?
By both.
Yeah.
By both.
I was going to say, because we see it on the other side too, where we've tried to convince people to market to the caregiver. And it works in certain markets like Alzheimer's, but in
Yeah.
others it's
Not so much.
Not so much,
Right.
yeah.
And so, every year in pharma companies, caregivers are put on the table, but either in the process of strategic planning, they're de-emphasized because the business case for how they contribute to sales, doesn't quite get there. Or programs are done but not at scale, or we run out of budget before we get there. But I think we're in an environment now with ACA, the Affordable Care Act, and the greater number of patients in the marketplace, bumping up against a shortage of caregivers. I'm sorry, not caregivers, healthcare professionals or providers.
Yeah.
That is causing a lot of people to begin to say, we're going to have to figure out how to engage the caregiver in the care of patients to a greater degree, simply because providers by themselves are not going to be able to provide the same degree of bandwidth.
Right.
And so I think that dynamic is going to cause publisher and manufacturer to pay more attention to caregiver over time.
And at the end of the day, in a world where it's all about results and outcomes, you're going to influence the influencer, right?
Absolutely.
It's kind of page one on the physician marketing side as well.
I often say to people that most of what I do in the interest of my health is because my wife and daughter nag me about it, right? It's not because it's something that I want to do myself.
Right, right.
So that's one opportunity on the patient side. The other on the patient side, I'll go back to content innovation. And by the way, this will also apply on the HCP side. I mean, we've got channels, and we've gotten quite good at getting basic information to customers through various channels. But if you take the content, quality, and level of innovation of most healthcare communications, and then compare that to what people, our customers, are seeing when they watch television at night, or if they go to Amazon.com, or if they're dealing with iTunes, right? Or Netflix, okay? Or Pinterest, big difference. And so I think that if we're going to be as successful at getting patients and caregivers to consume healthcare, if we're going to be as successful as that, as consumer packaged goods manufacturers have been at getting us to consume entertainment, food, cars,
Pretty high bar.
right? That we've got to actually appropriately figure out how to bring the same sort of content and production values and qualities to how we communicate about healthcare. So I think that mostly on the patient side, but this applies somewhat to HCP, is another opportunity. We've really got to up our game in terms of content, because, you know, if I'm getting the stuff that's really moving me at both a rational, emotional, and social level in the consumer space, and then I come over here to healthcare and you're being relatively bland, how much change and action are you really going to get out of me?
Sure.
So that's something to consider.
That's a big opportunity for our publishers.
It
because
is.
many of them are quite good at getting users to engage. You know, to your point before, that's why they're in business. They attract a certain set of users and they get them to engage. And some of them still need to break their traditional model of thinking about, you know, how to communicate with certain segments. Like, I think there's a stereotype that physicians only like pure clinical information. But when you look at usage, they actually like some other things, like even gamification in some cases.
Absolutely.
I mean, they like to be challenged. They like to be, voted. Voted. They like their questions and their answers to questions to be ranked against their peers.
That is right.
I mean, that kind of thing is a little different, but it's engaging.
That is right. And you know, even when you think about things like digital storytelling, which have been used primarily as a means of getting an emotive response or connection with customers, right? Well, doctors are human, and the savvy and effective use of digital storytelling as a complement to the relatively more logical, rational, scientific, clinical information that we give, if only to get doctors and patients to empathize with the real world plight of those that are suffering with diseases, I think is something that there are some examples of some good campaigns out there that have done it, but not nearly as many as there should be. And I think that publishers have an opportunity to actually influence both advertisers and manufacturers, I should say agencies and advertisers, in terms of how they bring these other types of approaches to bear in terms of how campaigns get run. And of course, when the publisher then gets the customer action as a result of that then benefits them as a result also. Yeah.
So on the physician side, we heard about data as a pain point, both cleanliness and willingness to share. We heard about content and really truly being engaging. What other pain points on the physician, or I'll open it up to broader, the other healthcare professionals, what other pain points are there that you struggle with?
Okay, so I would say, workflow integration. So
physician's workflow.
Yep. So increasingly, doctors are not in private practices. They are in, they're salaried employees of integrated delivery networks, dealing with an increasing patient load and having to be more and more efficient in how they practice medicine. And so doctors generally don't have the discretionary time that they used to have. Right. By the way, I should say healthcare providers in general, whether you're talking about doctors, nurses, PAMP, they just don't, and I'll include pharmacists in here also, right? They don't have the discretionary time that they used to have
And,
the
and
kind
as you
of
mentioned, the ratios changed. There's fewer of them per the patient
for the
population now,
patient,
so
exactly, right.
that's even a bigger constraint on time as well.
That is right.
Yeah.
So the more that we can bring the content that they used to need to leave their workflow to go get, say in a magazine, the more that we can integrate that into the electronic medical and health record so that it is just-in-time information that they get just in the natural flow of how they're interacting all day long with their peers and with patients and caregivers, I think that that's an opportunity.
So you're touching a hot button for me that I want to ask you about.
Okay.
We have a lot of opportunities to integrate within workflow.
Yep.
And the challenge that we have sometimes is convincing advertisers that when a doctor's in an EMR or another device, they don't want to get hit over the head with a brand.com ad. What they really want is they want value. They want a service.
Yeah.
And I know you're passionate about that. What are you seeing kind of 2-3 years out in the way of pharma offering more services or relevant communication instead of just kind of brand building
Instead of just
advertising?
advertising, yeah.
And what's stopping that from happening tomorrow instead of that far down the line?
Oh, okay. So I think that what's stopping it from happening is our current conventional wisdom about what drives a sale, right? And so we fundamentally, as a business model, sell pills, not services. I think that if there's any opportunity that's going to come out of the shift that we're seeing right now in accountability from pay for service to pay for outcome, is that pharma companies, and we'll see various manifestations of this, will be making decisions either proactively or passively about whether they are just going to be relatively low margin manufacturers of pills or whether they're actually going to convert themselves and move up the value chain or the value curve, I should say, to being healthcare outcomes companies. Right? And so I think that, let's talk about those companies that make that decision and move up the curve. Either whole company or new divisions of current companies, right? It can manifest in a number of different ways. I think that in those situations, what we're going to see in the future is that companies will have aligned themselves with partners in the ecosystem, payer, provider, pharmacy. They will have taken partial or whole accountability for providing some aspect of an outcome, which I believe will include information about the effectiveness of pharmacologicals, as well as information and methods coupled with technology that improve the probability, let me just call it compliance and adherence, right?
Yep.
It improves the probability that I not only will get the pill, but I will actually use the pill the way it ought to be used, right? And one could speculate, although there are some companies that are getting deeper into this now, that would be a combination. My doctor would give me a pill, there would be a corresponding app, if not a separate app, then some module within currently popular apps, some social community that would help to manage my expectations around how the medication is going to work and also provide support. And you could also imagine, and I saw a lot of this when I was out on the West Coast last week, that there would be an integrative healthcare component so that coupled with that, the doctor would be saying that because you're my patient, you're now going to be taken care of by a healthcare team, okay? And that might include a nutritionist, an acupuncturist, a chiropractor, a nurse practitioner, a health coach, right? And so I think that you're going to see pharma companies figuring out their place within this kind of broader care ecosystem, or you're going to see them kind of moving down, the value curve.
Generic pill manufacturer.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
When we spoke and had a conversation around the book a little while ago,
Yeah,
you painted that vision that you just described, which is quite a different world from where we are today, but it
Yeah.
is clearly where we need to go.
market's going to force us there.
It is.
Yeah.
When you talked about that, you mentioned a really interesting concept, I thought, which was the notion of actually getting all of those things, the social community, the app, actually into your labeling.
Yeah.
Which that fascinated me. You want to talk a little bit about what you're thinking there?
Yes, I can only talk conceptually about it, and this is something that a few other colleagues of mine in the industry, we've kind of like tossed around over coffee, hot chocolate, whatever, at times when we've gotten together. But obviously, the bounds of communication for any pharmacological is the label that's given to it by the FDA.
And that's what's holding you back from doing everything you just said today.
Is that it's not in the label.
Right.
So it creates various types of limitations.
Right.
But I'm looking forward to seeing a scenario. I don't know anyone who's actually doing this, but everything starts with someone uttering the impossible, right?
Right.
But actually doing the clinical trials in such a way that you're testing safety and efficacy, not just for the pharmacological, but the pharmacological plus that whole suite of add-on services and supports.
Yep.
So that when the FDA approves it, they actually approved a suite of pharmacological services and supports to get a particular outcome. Now, if you get that label from the FDA, you now, as a pharmaceutical company, insurance company, payer, or provider, right? It could be any one of those entities that do this, right? Now when you promote, you can promote all of that,
Yeah.
right?
That concept fascinates
Yeah.
me because
You can promote all of that.
it's not just about your first label that you get either. You can have an existing brand out there
Right.
today that works to create that
You're correct.
through partnerships or however it has to get done in a regulated environment today.
Yeah.
And then goes back for another label. And in effect, while it might not be as strong and defensible as a patent, in effect you've extended your unique proprietary relationship with the healthcare ecosystem,
Right.
in some ways in a stronger way than patent protection.
Yeah.
So I mean that is fascinating. I think
It
you
is.
will see that. I just think it's a question of when.
Yeah, and so what I'd like to do, I'd actually like to cite two colleagues of ours. You know both of these people I'm
Sure.
about to mention in articles that just recently came out in MM&M.
Yeah.
So Stan Woodland
Yep.
of CMI Compass did this leadership roundtable for James Chase,
Yep.
and it was about Beyond the Pill.
Yep.
And he made an interesting statement in that discussion. He said, what if a pharma company took the $700 or $800 million investment that we know currently they are thinking about investing in some, hopefully next blockbuster product, right? And actually instead invested that $700 to $800 million in some healthcare outcome startup for a particular population or within a given disease area, right? Wow, interesting, right?
Sure.
I mean, when you look at the number of products recently that kind of money have been invested in that didn't even get through FDA, right?
Yeah.
To peel off that kind of money for just one, get the right partners and work to get that to market is an interesting premise to think about.
It really is.
And then Zoe Dunn at Hale Advisors,
Sure.
right, did a blog post where she suggested, is it time for pharma to actually, market pharma services in addition to just pharma products, and suggested that somebody ought to conceive a commercial model. She called it the digital pharma company, and it would separate R&D. It would do all of those things about getting an outcome separate from R&D and kind of function, I guess you would call it as a marketing / behavioral modification entity, right? And it could be selective in what pharmacologicals it brings to bear, But in some ways, it would almost be competing with an accountable care organization, but without the doctors.
Yeah.
But of course, seeking those partnerships.
Yeah.
One of the things that I'd written when she wrote that, I said, that's a really interesting idea. And those of us who are strategic leaders in this space should be pulling out our business model canvases and actually starting to sketch up. What would that actually look like?
Yeah.
You know, so
It starts to look like pharma as actually a disruptor rather than being disrupted.
being disrupted, absolutely.
Yeah,
so it's
which is-
interesting.
That is interesting.
It is, yeah.
I like that.
So
So what we just talked about fascinates me.
can I mention one other
Yes,
thing?
please.
And I'm sorry if I'm running along here. One other opportunity I think there is KOL, COL. So, so there always have been on the healthcare professional side, key opinion leaders. Publishers work very closely with them, obviously,
Yeah.
who have
They help create.
build
those
trust, right? They kind of shape things,
Yep.
you know, perceptions and get information out there. Well, on the patient side, we've got this emergent group of what we call, some people call them health activists, some people call them consumer opinion leaders. Well, I think that publishers have an opportunity on both sides of the customer fence to continue to figure out and to think about how to bring to bear and to leverage the influence of KOLs and COLs. And by the way, within the KOL space, which is patently HCP, understand that there is an emergent group of informal or online opinion leaders.
Yep.
You may not see them publishing in JAMA and, you know, the ACP,
A lot of
but
physician blogs out
but
there
if you
that
go,
quite influential.
yes, if you go into the blogosphere or into Sermo or Dotsimity,
Yep.
you see that they carry quite good weight
Yep.
as of informal opinion leaders. And so I think that that's an opportunity, not a new one, but an evolving one that
Yeah.
publishers need to continue to pay attention to.
Yeah, it is interesting because I'll give you the kind of counterbalance on that, why we don't see the investment by the publishers as much as you might think. And it goes back to labeling, right? It goes
Yeah.
back to pharma having concerns about being in a social media environment, being in a user-generated, non-peer-reviewed environment.
Okay.
And so funding those initiatives can be more challenging in a lot of ways for publishers. Now, we always encourage them to find a different customer. I mean,
Yeah.
At the end of the day, you and I know pharma's going to be involved in those in a much deeper way than they are today.
Yeah.
And those spoils are going to go to the people who are investing today in those communities. So they need to figure out a way to have it funded until that happens.
That's a fair point. And you know, this might be controversial to say, but you know, we've had various I'll just use the word scandals, right?
Yeah.
Around how publishers have used key opinion leaders already, you know, in the industry. And I don't think, I mean, I'll stand corrected if I'm wrong here, but I don't think that publishers have backed away from the traditional KOLs. They've come up with innovative, different kinds of ways, maybe not innovative, but different kinds of ways of shoring up people's confidence around the ethics and the integrity as to how they work with them.
Yep.
Well, I think that that same level of ingenuity brought to this emerging trend in the opinion leader space,
Yeah.
you know, could do quite well.
I think what you sat through your fair share of MLR discussions. I think one of the key differentiators is that once it's online, it's there forever. There's the historical record that never goes away, which I think is different from, say, you know, KOL at a dinner meeting or something where nowadays, though, the reality is life is there forever, right? When people take pictures, they use Facebook. I mean,
You're right, that's true.
much of life today is captured, and I mean, here we are having a conversation. It's on video. It'll
Yep.
end up on the web. I mean, much of it is captured forever in a digital media format anyway today.
Yep, and I would say that that is a fair argument you make, except that I'm only talking about print.
Yeah.
So anything in print ends up digital,
Sure.
if only in Google Scholar,
Sure.
thus is permanent.
Sure.
So even if you take kind of the KOL, let's say that the dinner meetings and all that are out of bounds,
Yeah.
and just look at what we put in print, it would be very interesting. I don't have the research on this, but it would be interesting to ask the readers, patient and HCP, if it would add incremental value for them as a publishing experience to see the opinions and the thoughts of informal opinion leaders alongside formal opinion leaders.
Very interesting.
And the customer will let us know.
Yep,
Right.
very, very good.
Okay.